Okay, this evening I want to talk about the political history of Gaelic Scotland, and it seems a very apt moment in which to do so as we're in the run-up to a general election. So I want to talk about two things really. One is the way in which the Gaelic language and issues around Gaelic have been debated in the political system. And the second issue is to look at the electoral history of the Gaelic areas of Scotland. And I'm going to be principally talking about the Highlands and Islands, and look at the way in which they fitted in to the Scottish and British political system. Because on the one hand, there were very distinctive issues in the Highlands, but on the other hand, we shouldn't think of the Highlands or Gaelic Scotland as being entirely separate and cut off from the mainstream of British political history. The period I'm going to be talking about is really from the 1850s, 1860s, up to the late 20th century. If we think of the creation of the Scottish Parliament, maybe in 1999, as being the end point of this phase of political history. So if we go back to the middle of the 19th century and think about the way in which the Highlands were represented in the British political system, it's crucial to understand at this time only very few people were able to vote in the Scottish counties. Very small electorates, mostly based on people who held substantial property. We'll come back to that in a moment, because in the middle of the 1880s, the electorate was massively expanded. This system produced members of Parliament who were largely drawn from the landowning classes. And this slide shows a number of the people who represented Highland constituencies in this period. First of all, we have in the middle here the black and white pictures of Sir James Matheson, who was the Liberal MP, first of all for Inverness and then later for Ross-shire. He owned the island of Lewis. He'd made most of his money from the opium trade in China and Hong Kong, and he was a crucial individual in the development of the port of Hong Kong in the 1830s, at the end of the Opium War. So he massive landowner in the county of Ross-shire, as was his nephew, Sir Alexander Matheson, who was also engaged in the Jardine Matheson company. He was the MP for Inverness-shire, and occasionally his connections with the opium trade caused him political difficulties, such as at the election, I think it was in 1859, where his involvement in the opium trade was used by his opponents as a criticism. So the Mathesons, we've also got on the right-hand side of the screen, as you look at it, Donald Cameron of Lochiel, who was the MP for Inverness-shire in the 1870s. Cameron of Lochiel was interesting from this point of view because he was one of the few conservative MPs. In the 19th century, Scottish electoral history was dominated by the Liberal Party. From 1832 to 1918, there was only one election at which the Liberal Party didn't win a majority of seats in Scotland. So prior to the 1880s, we've really got an electoral system which is very restricted, and the people who represented Gaelic Scotland in Parliament were largely drawn from the landowning classes. Much of this changed in the 1880s, particularly just before the election of 1885, when the franchise in Scotland was reformed. So in 1885, an act was passed to give all householders in the Scottish counties the right to vote. And this meant that the county electorate was massively expanded. You can see from the figures on the slides that there were really only very small electorates. For example, the electorate in Sutherland before 1885 was only 300 or so voters. and after the expansion of the electorate in 1885, it went up to over 5,000 voters. So we've got a massive expansion of the electorate, and what that meant in the Highlands was that the mass of the crofting population were now able to vote. And the expansion of the electorate, of course, was something which happened all over the United Kingdom. But what was very distinctive in the Scottish Highlands in the 1880s was the fact that the crofters, newly enfranchised crofters, used their vote in a different way. Largely across the United Kingdom, new voters in 1885 used their vote to vote for the traditional parties, the Conservative Party, in Scotland mostly the Liberal Party. But the crofters in Scotland, newly enfranchised in 1885, used their vote to vote for a series of crofter candidates. And you can see from this first slide a series of pictures of some of the crofter candidates who were elected in 1885 and 1886. I'll just talk briefly about one or two of them because they're quite significant. This gentleman here with a very fine beard is Charles Fraser McIntosh, who's a very significant figure. He was elected MP for the town of Inverness in 1874. And then in 1885, he was the crofter candidate for the county seat, the Inverness Shire seat, which he continued to represent until 1892. Charles Fraser McIntosh was significant also from a Gaelic point of view. From 1874 onwards, he was known as the member for the Highlands because he was one of the few progressive members representing Highland constituencies, aside from the landowners who I was talking about earlier on. Fraser McIntosh advocated a number of causes. First of all, he was very significant in trying to improve the place of Gaelic in the Scottish education system. The education system had been reformed in 1872, and it made schooling compulsory for children between the ages of about 5 and 13. But the 1872 Act largely ignored the place of Gaelic in the school curriculum. And Charles Fraser McIntosh raised that issue in Parliament and began to begin the moves to have Gaelic provided for in a proper way in the school curriculum. The early insertions of Gaelic in the school curriculum were quite minimal. There were few teachers, for example, who were really capable of teaching in Gaelic to a reasonable standard. But it was the first legislative attempt to put Gaelic in the school curriculum after the state took over the Scottish education system in 1872. Fraser McIntosh is also significant from a Gaelic point of view because of his efforts to have a question about Gaelic in the census, which takes place every 10 years. So in the run-up to the 1881 census, Charles Fraser McIntosh argued strongly in Parliament and with the Registrar General for Scotland that there should be a question to elicit information about the number of Gaelic speakers in Scotland. And that question was first asked at the census of 1881. So the information that we have about the number of Gaelic speakers in Scotland owes its origins to Charles Fraser McIntosh. Two of the other MPs here in the centre. First of all, we have Angus Sutherland, who was the MP for, conveniently enough, for the county of Sutherland, of which he was a native. Angus Sutherland was one of the more radical members of Parliament. He was a strong land reformer. He believed in the idea of land nationalisation. And he was very closely connected with some of the politics of the Irish community in urban Scotland. Even more radical, perhaps, is the gentleman in the middle of the picture. This is Dr. G.B. Clark, Dr. Gavin Brown Clark, who was the MP for Caithness. And Clark was, I think, even more radical than Angus Sutherland. In some senses, he was probably the most left-wing member of the British Parliament between 1885 and 1900, when he represented Caithness. He was also a strong believer in nationalisation of the land, and he also was, interestingly, a very strong anti-imperialist. He opposed, for example, the conduct and the very essence of the British campaign during the Boer War in South Africa, both the first Boer War in the early 1880s and the second Boer War between 1899 and 1902. And at the general election of 1900, he was criticised for being, in that respect, unpatriotic, and he lost his seat to a liberal imperialist candidate. So that's a good example of one of the issues I was laying out at the beginning of the lecture, that these big questions, in this case, in Caithness, the question about the role of the empire was played out in a constituency in the north of Scotland. The gentleman here is another London doctor. This is Dr. Roderick MacDonald, who was the MP for Ross-shire, and in some senses is less well known than some of the other Crofter MPs. If he's remembered at all, he's largely remembered for his role as the coroner in the Whitechapel murders, the Jack the Ripper case in 1888. So what's evident here is that in an age when members of Parliament weren't paid, members of Parliament weren't paid until 1910, it wasn't really possible for people from the working class or from the crofting community to become members of Parliament. And although these individuals represented the crofters in a more progressive way than the landowners who I was talking about earlier on, many of them had independent income. So Clark, MacDonald were doctors, Sutherland had been a school teacher, Fraser McIntosh a solicitor and property developer in Inverness. And in some senses they were criticised for not being sufficiently close to the crofting community, but they were certainly a lot closer than the landowners whom they succeeded in Parliament. And the lady on the right-hand side of the slide, as you look at it, is a very important figure in thinking about the way in which Gaelic is used in the electoral system. This is Mary Vaughan and Oren, Mary Macpherson, a very significant poetess, wrote a series of Gaelic songs about the 1885 and 1886 elections. She was very close to Charles Fraser McIntosh, who had defended her in a court case in Inverness in the 1870s when she was accused of theft unjustly. And her poetry is a very good example of the way in which Gaelic poetry was used to communicate political ideas in the 1880s. There were newspapers in circulation, in particular John Murdochs Highlander newspaper, but oral means of communication through Gaelic songs and poetry was a particularly significant way of communicating political ideas. So we can see here from this table that in the 1886 election, Crofter MPs were elected right across the Highlands. In Argyll, Donald McFarlane, Crofter MP, who'd been elected in 1885, was defeated. But you see that Clark was elected in Caithness, Charles Fraser McIntosh in Inverness shire, Roderick MacDonald in Ross-shire, and Angus Sutherland, who had been defeated in 1885, won the Sutherland shire election in 1886. You'll see that Charles Fraser McIntosh's label here is Crofter / Liberal Unionist, because unlike the other Crofter MPs, he opposed the idea of home rule for Ireland, and he came forward as a unionist, so he wanted to maintain the union between Britain and Ireland. So again, another example of the way in which these big political questions were played out in the Highlands. The background to the political history of the 1880s in Gaelic Scotland was the Crofter land protests of the decade, beginning in Skye in the early 1880s at Glendale and Braes and Kilmuir. A series of protests raised the issue of the Highland land question and energized the Crofters, engaging in protest, giving evidence to a large-scale royal commission, the Napier Commission, which toured the Highlands in 1883 and reported in 1884. And that was the background to which Crofters were stimulated and motivated to vote for these Crofter MPs in the elections of 1885 and 1886. And indeed, in 1886, the Crofters Holdings Scotland Act was passed, which gave Crofters security of tenure and other rights. And those rights remain, and that code of crofting legislation remains in place down to the present day. We see again, here's another couple of poems from the 1885 and 1886 election. This is a poem from a man called John MacLean of Mulbooey in Easter Ross about the what he calls the heroes of the election campaign. How proud we can be with Dr. MacDonald, MP for Rossshire, and McFarlane and Fraser McIntosh, the people we were talking. But he says the people of Sutherland are a disgrace. You see from the last line of the extract there, and that was a reference to the way in which Angus Sutherland was defeated in the Sutherlandshire election in 1885. So this is an example not so much of political communication, but of political commentary through the means of a Gaelic poem. That's great. This poem is interesting as well because it talks about the difficulties which people had in voting in 1885. This is a song in praise of Donald McFarlane, the MP for Argyll, and it relates the way in which crofters from Mull had to struggle over very difficult weather. The 1885 election took place in November during the winter, and polling stations weren't open from 7 o'clock in the morning until 10 o'clock at night in the way that they are now. They were only open for a few hours in the middle of the day. There weren't so many polling stations. People had to travel great distances to be able to vote. So the physical challenges of actually exercising your franchise in the difficult geography of the Scottish Highlands is evident in these winter elections, and elections which do take place in the winter are extremely difficult in the Highlands, as we'll see from a couple of later examples. That's great. This is another Gaelic poem, which is really a reference to, again, wider political issues. This is a reference to the activities of a man called Henry George, the so-called prophet of San Francisco. Again, another an American land reformer who had very advanced ideas about the land question and who toured the Highlands on a number of occasions in the 1880s. And he believed in an idea called the single tax, which would effectively tax private land ownership out of existence. These ideas, he believed, were particularly relevant to the Highlands, where the concentration of land ownership in private hands was particularly iniquitous. We see here Henry George on the right of the slide, and a couple of other individuals which again exemplify this theme of major, wider political issues being played out in the Highlands. On the left of the screen, as you look at it, is a man called John Murdoch, who owned and edited a newspaper called the Highlander, which was published in Inverness from 1873 to 1882. And Murdochs Highlander was one of the first newspapers to really present news and political ideas from the perspective of the Crofters and the Gaelic community. There was quite a lot of Gaelic content in Murdochs Highlander, some of it written by clergymen, such as Alexander MacGregor, and others, much of it written by Murdoch himself. And it was one of the few newspapers to present also a very positive view of Irish developments to readers in Highland Scotland. Because again, Irish issues were debated and played out throughout the British political system in the 1870s and 1880s, and that was evident in the Highlands as well, as we've seen from Fraser McIntosh's unionist ideas. The man in the centre of the screen is Michael Davitt, the Irish nationalist and progressive, who's a very significant figure in the movement for Irish land reform and Irish home rule from the 1870s, and his release from prison right down to his death in 1906. And Michael Davitt significantly toured the Highlands on a number of occasions in 1882, and then maybe more significantly in 1886, 1887, giving speeches about the land question, about Irish issues and their relationship with the Highlands in locations right across the Highlands. He toured the region by train. And as I said earlier, we have Henry George on the right of the screen. You might say, what's the other side of this political debate? We've heard a lot about the views of the Crofters, the Crofter MPs, progressive ideas about the land question. Well, probably the most significant person to argue against that was the 8th Duke of Argyll, who you see here on the right of the screen. He was the person really who organized the, in an intellectual sense, maybe more than a practical sense, and argued against land reformist ideas. He argued in favor of the traditional idea of private ownership of land. He was a very significant political figure himself. He served as Secretary of State for India in Gladstone's government from 1868 to 1874. He was also in Gladstone's cabinet in the early 1880s, but resigned in 1881 over Irish land reform. And two of his sons represented Argyll in the 1870s and early 1880s, and his influence spread throughout the county of Argyll prior to the enfranchisement of the Crofters in 1885. The gentleman on the left of the screen is a significant figure. This is John Stuart Blackie, Professor of Greek at the University of Edinburgh. And he's there really because of his strident advocacy in the 1870s and early 1880s, again in the cause of Gaelic, this time in an attempt to raise money to endow a chair of Celtic, a professorship of Celtic at the University of Edinburgh. And that was a major political and cultural issue in the Highlands and throughout Scotland and the Empire, indeed, in the late 70s, early 80s. And the first professor, Donald McKinnon, from Colonsay, was appointed in 1882. So Blackie and Argyll present a rather different kind of political point of view in the Highlands. Significant major political figures also had an interest. This is on the right of the screen, Sir William Harcourt, the Home Secretary, and in the days before the creation of the Scottish Office in 1885, the Home Secretary was the main political figure with administrative responsibility for Scottish affairs. And on the left of the screen, you see a caricature of Gladstone, the Prime Minister. And both of those individuals who were central to the creation of the Crofters Act in 1886 had quite close connections to the Highlands. Gladstone had family connections to Dingwall and other parts of Ross-shire through his mother's family. And Harcourt knew the Highlands well. He spent summers sailing around the Hebrides in his yacht. And I think in those senses that maybe helped them to be somewhat sympathetic towards the Crofters during the crisis of the 1880s and to appoint the Royal Commission and ultimately to help the passage of the Crofters Act in 1886, which was brought through during a government led by Gladstone. So if we move forward from the 1880s, what can we say about the political history of the Highlands in the 20th century? A very significant event took place in Inverness in 1921, and we see some pictures here from the first meeting of the cabinet to be held outside London, outside Downing Street. And the cabinet met in Inverness, in the town hall in Inverness, in the summer of 1921, in August 1921, in order to make some quite important decisions relating to the place of Ireland in the United Kingdom during the Irish War of Independence, and ultimately leading up to the partition of Ireland in 1921. Why, you might ask, was the cabinet brought together in Inverness, in the town hall? Well, the interesting thing is that was simply the most convenient place to gather all the members of the cabinet, because so many of them were in the north of Scotland, engaged in sporting activities on the grouse moors and stalking in the deer forests. The king, for example, was staying at Moy, just south of Inverness. Winston Churchill was staying at Dunrobin with the 5th Duke of Sutherland, who was a close friend. Churchill was painting rather than stalking or shooting. Lloyd George was at Gaidhlig on the west coast, playing golf in Lloyd George's case. But many other ministers were in the Highlands, and this cabinet meeting was held in Inverness, and representatives of Sinn Féin, the Irish nationalist movement, were also present in Inverness as they needed to communicate with ministers. And this, I think, tells us something about the place of the Highlands in the structures of political power in Britain in the early 20th century. And the political class was familiar with the Highlands as a space for their sporting activities. So the political class were invested in the landscape emptied of people. And those people replaced first by sheep and then by deer in the 19th century. And made available for sporting activities by the social and, in this case, political elite. And that, I think, tells us something about the way in which the landscape changed and the relationship between that landscape and powerful political elites. So you see here an image of the cabinet in the Inverness town hall, and also a document which was signed by all the members of the cabinet, which is still displayed in Inverness. Another interesting event, which again exemplifies this theme of wider political issues played out in the Highlands, can be seen with a by-election which took place in Ross-shire in 1936. The MP for Ross-shire, Ian Macpherson, had been ennobled, and a very interesting by-election took place, which curiously the national government or coalition government candidate was Malcolm MacDonald, who was the son of Ramsay MacDonald. The independent Conservative candidate was Randolph Churchill, son of Winston Churchill. So you had two prime ministers' sons contesting this election in the middle of the winter in early 1936. And the Labour candidate was Hector McNeill, who you see on the right of the photograph when he was a Foreign Office Minister in the 1950s, with Ernest Bevin there at the United Nations. McNeill was the Labour Party candidate. He went on to be a minister in the Foreign Office and Secretary of State for Scotland in the Labour government of the early 1950s. So it was a by-election which attracted huge publicity because of the attractive and famous celebrity candidates that were engaged in this campaign. The election was disturbed not only by bad weather but by the death of the king in early 1936, before ultimately MacDonald triumphed and was the MP for Ross-shire from 1936 until 1945, I think. So that again was a moment in which the political ideas being debated in Britain in the middle of the 1930s were played out across the wintry landscape of Ross and Cromarty. And if we look across the political history of the Highlands in the 20th century, one of the things we can see, and I'll show you some maps in a moment, is the way in which the different political parties thought about the Highlands. One point is the survival of the Liberal Party, which dominated Scottish politics in the 19th century, but was deeply divided by the early 20th century, particularly by the aftermath of the First World War, and was finding its political popularity being eroded. But one place that it managed to hang on was in the rural areas of Scotland, both in the borders and southwest of Scotland, but also in the Highlands and the northeast of Scotland. So the gentleman on the right of the screen, as you look at it there, is Sir Archibald Sinclair, leader of the independent Liberals in the interwar period, a member of the Sinclair of Ulster family. His grandfather had represented the seat in the 1870s, and he held the seat from 1918, I think, until he was defeated in the 1945 election. So he's a good example of the way in which liberalism hung on in the Highlands. The gentleman in the centre of the screen is Malcolm Macmillan, who was the MP for the Western Isles, which was a new parliamentary constituency created in 1918. Formerly, the Western Isles had been divided. The island of Lewis was in the county of Ross-shire. Harris, North Uist, Benbecula, South Uist, Barra, and other islands were in the county of Inverness-shire. But in 1918, when constituency boundaries were redrawn, a new constituency, the Western Isles, was created. And from 1935 until 1970, it was represented for the Labour Party by Malcolm Macmillan, a local figure from Stornoway. He was succeeded by Donald Stewart, who in 1970 became the first SNP member to win a seat at a general election. And he held the seat until 1983. So the politics is currently held by the SNP. So the politics of the new Western Isles constituency were very much driven by local politicians with important footholds in the local area. Macmillan, Stewart were both associated with Stornoway and Lewis. The current MP, Angus Brendan McNeill, an SNP MP, is from the island of Barra, the first member from that end of the island chain to represent the seat. The figure on the left is interesting because again it represents this idea of wider political issues. This is Willie Ross, the Secretary of State for Scotland in the 1960s and 1970s in the Labour governments of that period, and he brought forward the Highlands and Islands Development Bill, which established the HIDB, the Highlands and Islands Development Board, which was an attempt to implement the ideas of state planning which the Wilson governments of the 1960s were very interested. But he argued for this in a very interesting way in the Highlands. He said in a speech, I think given in Inverness in 1965, that the Highlander was the man on Scotland's conscience, and that the reason why something like the Highlands and Islands Development Board had to be established was because of the traumatic history of the Gaelic-speaking areas of Scotland, the history of clearance and eviction and emigration, which is what Willie Ross was primarily thinking about. And it's interesting that some of those same arguments were used by Gladstone in the 1880s to put forward the Crofters Act. So we see here a number of maps which show the way in which the Liberal Party hung on in the Highlands. And to an extent, there was a different political system in the rural and peripheral, if I may use that word, areas of the Highlands. You see the different shades of yellow. Here are Liberal MPs, National Liberal and Independent Liberal. And you see the way in which they dominated the politics of the Highlands. This is the 1922 election at which the Labour Party, you see the red representation across the industrial areas of central Scotland. And the Labour Party made its important breakthrough in 1922. But you see the way in which the Highlands are still dominated by the Liberal Party. So that's almost a survival of 19th century political traditions. And by 1955, that had changed somewhat. And you see the way in which the political map of Scotland was polarised between Labour seats in the central belt in the industrial areas and Conservative or Unionist, as they were known, MPs in the north of Scotland. The only sort of way in which the Liberals were clinging on to political representation was in Orkney and Shetland, seat won by Joe Grimmond in the 1950s and held until, well, right down to the present day. The Liberals hang on in Orkney and Shetland. And by 1979, you see some elements of liberalism. Russell Johnson, the MP for Inverness Shire, representing that constituency, and the SNP by this time holding the Western Isles, and the Liberals also hanging on in Orkney and Shetland. One notable Gaelic figure who tried very hard to restore liberalism in Scotland was the famous rugby player and very significant Gaelic figure, John M. Bannerman. And Bannerman stood, I think, 6 or 7 times as a Liberal candidate from 1945 until 1966. And several of his political contests were in Highland constituencies, in Argyll in 1945, and in Inverness Shire, where he almost won a by-election in December 1954. And again, he argued that if that election had been held in the spring or summer, he would have been able to get his vote out to a greater extent and may have won that seat. And Bannerman used his Gaelic identity. He communicated with the voters in Gaelic. He was well known as a Gaelic personality on television, as well as through his prowess on the rugby field which he'd been a very successful rugby player in the 1920s. So we come up almost to the present day, and if we look at the 1997 election, we see something of a return to earlier patterns of representation in the Highlands. I wouldn't go much beyond this. It'll be interesting to see in the general election upcoming the extent to which the Liberals might be able to, or the Liberal Democrats as they are now, might be able to find a way back into political representation in the Highlands. But you see here in 1997, the Labour Party have recovered the Western Isles. Labour MP called Callum MacDonald represented that seat. But you can see from Argyll in the southern end of the Highlands, right through Inverness Shire, Ross Shire, Caithness and Sutherland, Orkney and Shetland, the Liberal Party have, at that election, recovered those seats. So that's almost the same pattern as the 1922 election, or in the way in which the Liberals represent the north of Scotland, very similar perhaps even to the elections of the 1880s. So I think we can see in this brief and rather superficial survey of the politics of Gaelic Scotland, a couple of points emerge. First of all, there are very distinctive issues being played out in the Highlands, issues relating to the land question, to the place of Gaelic in the education system or in the census. But we can also, on the other hand, see the way in which big political issues are played out in the Highlands. And we shouldn't think of the Highlands as having a separate and distinct and somehow inferior political system. Major issues relating to Ireland, to the Empire, have been played out in the Highland constituencies. So the political history of Gaelic Scotland is on the one hand distinctive, but it's also a place in which the big political issues of the day have been discussed and debated. Thank you.